The snow had been falling since before the service ended. It came down the way it does in November in Manitoba. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just steady and indifferent, covering the flat cemetery in a pale quiet that made everything feel smaller. There were 4 folding chairs set out beside the grave. Only one was used. My grandfather was buried on a Tuesday morning. No reception afterward. No gathering at the house. No casseroles dropped off by neighbors. He had outlived most of the people who would have come. The United Church minister read 2 passages, said a few careful words about a man he had never met, and that was that. The groundskeeper waited at a respectful distance while I placed a single white rose on the lowered casket. My grandfather had never liked flowers. I brought one anyway. I was walking back to my car when the man appeared. He came from the direction of the parking lot, moving with the deliberate, unhurried pace of someone who had planned to be exactly here at exactly this time. He was older, perhaps 70, dressed in a dark wool coat with no insignia, no uniform. Nothing about him announced who he was, but there was something in the way he carried himself that made you pay attention without knowing why. He stopped a few feet from me and said my name. Not as a question. I said yes. He nodded once, as though confirming something he already knew. I was a colleague of your grandfather's, he said. His voice was quiet and unhurried. I'm very sorry for your loss. He was a precise man. I thanked him. I assumed he meant a former colleague from the surveying firm my grandfather had worked at before he retired. My grandfather, Robert Callahan, had spent 30 years as a land surveyor for the federal government, mostly in northern Manitoba and the territories. It wasn't glamorous work. He drove long distances alone. He came home tired. He read the Winnipeg Free Press every morning and never talked much about his days. The man reached into his coat and produced a plain white envelope. He held it out to me with both hands, which struck me as oddly formal. There is a firm in Zurich, he said. Burkhardt and Associates. I'd like you to contact them. He paused. Tell them your grandfather's full name and his service number. I looked at him. His service number, I repeated. He kept his expression even. They will know what it means. I took the envelope. Inside was a card with a phone number printed on it, a Swiss country code, and beneath the number, in neat, precise handwriting, the name of the firm. Before I could ask a single question, he said, "He thought the world of you." Then he turned and walked back toward the parking lot. I watched him until he reached a dark sedan and drove away. I stood in the falling snow for a long moment, the card in my gloved hand. I did not tell my uncle about it. My uncle, Patrick, had driven up from Portage la Prairie the morning of the funeral and was back on the highway before noon. He and my grandfather had not been close, and he made no effort to pretend otherwise. He arrived with a list of questions about the estate written on the back of a gas receipt, the house, the truck, the contents of the garage, and asked them in the parking lot before we had even gone inside. He was not cruel about it. He was simply efficient in a way that felt wrong that day. My grandfather had left a straightforward will, prepared with a notary in Dauphin. The house went to me. A small savings account, some tools, a truck with 200,000 kilometers on it. My uncle received a watch and a set of fishing rods. He had nodded at this information without expression and said he figured as much. That evening, alone in my grandfather's house for the first time, I sat at his kitchen table and held the card the man had given me. The house smelled like instant coffee and cedar, and the faint particular smell of old maps, which my grandfather had kept rolled in cardboard tubes stacked along the hallway. I had grown up visiting this house every summer. I knew every room. I thought I knew what was in it. I turned the card over in my fingers. Burkhardt and Associates. Zurich. My grandfather had been a federal land surveyor. He drove a used Silverado and bought his shirts at Mark's work warehouse. He grew tomatoes in the backyard and complained about the cost of propane. Nothing in his life pointed toward Switzerland. I opened the drawer beside the kitchen sink where he kept miscellaneous things. Batteries, twist ties, expired coupons, and there, under a small Manitoba road atlas, was his passport. I almost didn't recognize it as significant. Then I opened it. The pages were dense with stamps. Switzerland 4 times, Germany twice, Austria once, Iceland twice, back to Switzerland. The dates began almost 25 years earlier and continued through the previous spring. Trips that lasted 2 to 5 days at a time. Trips no one in our family had ever been told about. I sat down on the edge of his bed and read through every stamp twice. My uncle called that night around 9. He didn't ask how I was doing. He asked whether the notary had sent the probate documents yet. I told him it would take a few weeks. He said he hoped I wasn't planning to sell the house without a proper appraisal. I told him I hadn't made any decisions. He said he just wanted to make sure everything was handled fairly. That word, fairly. After I hung up, I looked at the Swiss phone number again for a long time. I was a secondary school science teacher in Brandon. I drove a sensible car and packed my lunch and filed my taxes on time. I was not someone who received mysterious cards at funerals or flew to European cities on the advice of strangers, but something about the way the man had spoken was not mysterious at all. It was methodical, like he was completing a step in a process that had been waiting. I called the number the following morning. A man answered. His English was impeccable and entirely without warmth, which somehow made it more reassuring. I gave him my grandfather's full name. I told him I had been contacted by a colleague of his after the funeral. There was a brief pause, then the sound of something being typed. Robert James Callahan, he said. Yes. We have been expecting this call. He asked when I could travel. I said I needed 2 weeks to arrange a substitute for my classes and sort out my grandfather's immediate affairs. He said that was entirely reasonable. He asked me to bring my own identification, a copy of the death certificate, and my grandfather's SIN card if I could locate it. I found the SIN card in the locked file cabinet in his home office, along with a folder of documents I had never known existed. Federal contracts, security clearance renewals, letters on Natural Resources Canada letterhead, but also correspondence with an organization I didn't recognize, written in very careful language about something described only as long-term resource assessment support. The dates on the letters went back to the late 1990s. My grandfather had not simply been a land surveyor. Or rather, he had been a land surveyor, but in the territories, in the north, in the kinds of places where there was no one else for hundreds of kilometers, he had also done something else. Something that had apparently warranted a security clearance renewed every 5 years until he was 73. Patrick texted me that week twice. Once to ask about the truck and once to say he'd spoken to a real estate agent in Dauphin who could give us a number on the house whenever we were ready. I replied to both messages with short, neutral answers and did not tell him about the file cabinet or the passport or the number I had called. I booked a flight to Zurich on a Thursday. I told my department head I had a family matter to attend to. I did not tell anyone else. On the flight over, somewhere above the Atlantic, I read through the documents again. My grandfather had been precise and thorough in everything he maintained. His handwriting in the margins of certain papers was small and exact, like the man himself. He had never raised his voice in my presence. Not once. He had been the kind of person who, when something was wrong, simply became quieter. I thought about the summers I had spent at his house as a child. He had taught me to read a topographic map on the kitchen table, tracing the contour lines with his finger, explaining how elevation hid in the numbers. He had taught me to look at a landscape and understand what was underneath it before you understood what was on top. He had never mentioned Switzerland. Zurich in late November was cold and precise in equal measure. The airport was efficient and calm. I took a taxi through streets that were clean in the particular way of cities that have been organized for centuries, where tidiness is structural rather than effortful. The offices of Burkhardt and Associates were in a low building near the river, unmarked except for a small brass plate beside the door. Inside, a woman at the reception desk asked for my name and made a brief call. Within a few minutes, a man in his late 50s came to meet me. He introduced himself as Mr. Burkhardt. He had gray at his temples and the manner of someone who had spent decades managing the weight of other people's careful decisions. He offered me tea, which I accepted, and led me to a small private office. He closed the door. "I am very sorry about your grandfather," he said. He was a meticulous man. We valued our relationship with him greatly. I asked him directly what the relationship was. He folded his hands on the desk. "Your grandfather established a private holding trust with us in 1999. He said it has been maintained and managed conservatively since that time. He opened a folder and turned it toward me. The numbers were not what I expected. I had prepared myself for something modest. Perhaps a savings account. Perhaps a small investment portfolio from a man who had been careful with money for decades. What I was looking at was a trust currently valued at just over $9 million. I stared at the page for a moment without speaking. Mr. Burkhart waited. "This isn't possible," I said. He turned the folder back toward himself and reviewed it briefly. "The principal contributions were made over a period of approximately 12 years, he said, beginning in 1999. The remainder is growth. Your grandfather was a conservative investor and he declined all suggestions to accelerate returns. He was patient. I thought of the tomatoes in the backyard, the Mark's shirts, the truck." "What was the source of the contributions?" I asked. He chose his words precisely. "Your grandfather provided legitimate consulting services to several organizations during his career, in addition to his federal employment. The compensation was substantial and entirely above board." He paused. He was very clear that the funds were not for personal enrichment. Then what were they for? Mr. Burkhart slid a sealed envelope across the desk. "This was left with us to be delivered at this meeting," he said. "In your grandfather's handwriting." My hands were steady when I picked it up. "I don't know why I noticed that. I set it in my lap." He continued explaining the structure of the trust. "I was named as the successor trustee. The principal was restricted from lump sum withdrawal. The trust had designated distributions going out quarterly to a list of beneficiaries, all anonymous in the documents, described in general categories: Northern Community Infrastructure Support, Indigenous Youth Education Access, Environmental Remediation Research. My grandfather had grown up in a small Creek community near the pass before being taken south for residential schooling at age 7. He never spoke about it, not once in my entire life. I had known it the way you know certain things about family, as a fact, with no texture around it, a door that was always closed. I opened the envelope after Mr. Burkhart stepped out to give me privacy. The paper was the same kind my grandfather kept in his home office. Graph paper, slightly yellowed at the edges. "If you're reading this," he had written, "it means I didn't find a better time to explain. I'm sorry for that. I was never good at the explaining part." His handwriting was small and exact, the same as the margins of his field notes. He wrote that the consulting work had begun after a colleague, someone he trusted, had approached him about the value of certain knowledge of terrain, of water tables, of mineral deposits in places where no one else had been. He had spent decades walking ground that governments and corporations were quietly trying to understand. He had been paid well for information he was never asked to publicize. He had understood, clearly, what that information would be used for, and he had made a choice. Not the choice of taking the money and looking away. The other one. Every dollar he took, he wrote, went back into the trust. He had structured the distributions himself, working with Mr. Burkhart over years to direct funding toward the communities most affected by the decisions his information had helped make. He wrote, "I couldn't stop what was happening, but I could make sure something came back." He had never told my grandmother. He had never told my mother, who had died when I was 11. He had never told Patrick. He had told no one. He had simply built the thing and waited. Near the end of the letter, he wrote, "I picked you because you are careful, not because you're mine. There's a difference." I sat in that small office in Zurich for a long time. When my phone buzzed, I already knew who it was. Patrick. I let it ring twice before answering. "So," he said immediately. "The notary called me. Said probate could take a while. You're not dragging your feet on this, are you?" "I'm still dealing with some things," I said. "What kind of things?" "Paperwork," I said. There was a pause. "He left the house to you," he said. "I get that. But there might be other assets. You'd tell me if there were, right?" I looked at the graph paper on the desk in front of me. "I'll be in touch when I know more," I said. He exhaled. "You sound like him," he said. "You know that? You never just say what you mean." I thought that was probably the most honest thing Patrick had ever said to me. I told him I'd call him when I was back in Canada. When I flew home, I carried the trust documents in my carry-on and my grandfather's letter folded in my coat pocket. The prairies looked different from the air on the descent into Winnipeg. I had grown up thinking of them as flat. My grandfather had tried for years to explain that flat was a surface impression, that underneath everything had structure. Patrick arrived at the house in Dauphin 3 days after I returned. He let himself in through the back door the way he always had, like the house already belonged to the version of the future he had decided on. He moved through the kitchen with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at things with the particular expression of someone taking inventory rather than remembering. He sat across from me at the kitchen table and told me he'd spoken to a lawyer in Portage-la Prairie. He said his lawyer believed there might be assets that hadn't been disclosed in the will, and that as a surviving child of the deceased's only son, he had standing to request a full accounting. I told him there was a trust. His expression shifted. How much? It's not a number that changes your situation, I said. It's a structure. He stared at me. What does that mean? It means it's not divisible, I said. It's a trust. The funds are already designated. Designated to who? To the communities he worked near. To education access. To remediation. Patrick sat back. So, he left $9 million to strangers. He left it to the people he felt responsible to. He laughed, not with humor. This is unbelievable, he said. He barely spoke to me for the last 20 years. He couldn't write a check to his own son's family. He had to go full saint? I didn't say anything. He leaned forward. You can contest this, he said. His tone was careful now, like someone trying a different key in the same lock. If the funds weren't disclosed, if there are grounds to argue diminished capacity or undue influence. He was surveying the boreal shield until he was 73, I said. His capacity was fine. You know what I mean. I do know what you mean, I said. And the answer is no. He stood up. You're choosing a dead man's guilt project over your own family. He chose this, I said. I'm just keeping it. Patrick left without taking the fishing rods. That evening I sat at the kitchen table again with the folder from the trust. The documentation was thorough. Summarized distributions, not individual names, but categories and regions. Communities in northern Manitoba, northern Ontario, a partnership with a land trust organization in Saskatchewan. My grandfather's contribution to the world had been almost entirely invisible. He had mapped things that were used against people. And then he had spent 25 years quietly moving money in the other direction. He had not absolved himself, he had not looked for absolution. He had simply done the most useful thing he could think of, and then kept doing it. I contacted a lawyer in Winnipeg, a woman named Harriet Chin, who specialized in trust and estate law. She reviewed the documents and called me back within 48 hours. The trust is solid, she said. Swiss law, properly registered, referenced in the will under the clause about additional holdings. He was thorough. I know, I said. Your uncle will likely file a challenge, she said. It's not uncommon. I told her I expected it. She was quiet for a moment. The structure he built, she said. It's unusual. It has a family stabilization clause, she paused. Are you aware of that? I said I wasn't. She explained it. My grandfather had built in a provision that allowed the trustee, me, to allocate a capped annual amount toward direct family support, provided the recipient engaged with a certified financial advisor and the distributions were structured and documented. He hadn't cut Patrick out. He had put a door in the wall and left me the key. He had trusted me to decide whether to open it. Patrick filed a challenge 6 weeks later. Not dramatic. A formal petition in the Manitoba Court of King's Bench, citing inadequate disclosure in the estate and requesting a full accounting of foreign holdings. The hearing was in Winnipeg in February. The courtroom was beige and fluorescing in unhurried. Harriet sat beside me and remained entirely calm. Patrick's lawyer argued that the trust represented assets that should have been disclosed as part of the estate, and that the beneficiary designations were structured to bypass legitimate heirs. Harriet responded without raising her voice. The trust predates any relevant claim by 25 years. The existence of foreign holdings was referenced in the will. The structure is legally sound under both Swiss and Canadian law. The judge, a woman with reading glasses pushed to the end of her nose, reviewed the documentation carefully. She asked several procedural questions. She requested additional verification from the Swiss office. Outside the courtroom during the recess, Patrick spoke to me directly for the first time all morning. "You could end this," he said. "How?" I asked. "Give me something real, not conditions, not supervised distributions, just a fair share." "It's not mine to give," I said. He looked at me with something that had moved past anger into a kind of exhausted disappointment. "You're just like him," he said. "The two of you always had your own language." I thought about that. Maybe we did. The second hearing brought the supporting documents from Burkhart and Associates. 25 years of records, investment statements, distribution logs, correspondence. Everything clean and consistent. The judge reviewed the new materials and delivered her ruling in 15 minutes. "The trust is valid," she said. "The challenge is dismissed." Patrick didn't speak to me in the courthouse parking lot. He stood beside his car for a moment, looking at the flat gray February sky, and then he drove away. I drove back to Dauphin. I had taken a leave of absence from teaching for the semester, which my principal had been generous about. I sat at the kitchen table that had been my grandfather's kitchen table and read his letter again. I couldn't stop what was happening, but I could make sure something came back. It took me 3 weeks to drive to Portage-la-Prairie. Patrick's house was a bungalow on a quiet street. The driveway needed resurfacing. The Eave-Strauss had pulled away from the roofline on one side. He opened the door and looked at me without surprise. I told him I wasn't there about the trust. "Then what are you here about?" "The family clause," I said. He had one. He let me in. We sat in his kitchen, which smelled like old coffee. The same as every kitchen in our family apparently did. He didn't offer me anything. "I'm not here to manage you," I said, "but there's a provision for family stabilization. Structured support. A financial advisor paid for by the trust. Capped annual distributions tied to a plan." He looked at the table. "So I get an allowance," he said. "With conditions." "You get a path," I said. He built it in deliberately. That surprised him, I could tell. He hadn't expected that. He had expected the trust to be a wall. Finding out it had a door changed his expression in a way that was hard to watch. "He never talked to me," Patrick said finally. "Not really." "I know." "He talked to you." "I think he talked to me about surfaces," I said. "I didn't know what was underneath either. Not until Zurich." He was quiet for a moment. "I thought he just didn't have anything," he said. "I thought he was tight. Withholding." "He was directing," I said. Patrick exhaled slowly. "That doesn't make it easier." "I know," I said. "I'm not asking you to think he was perfect. I'm asking if you want help." He looked at me for a long time. "What does it actually involve?" "Spreadsheets," I said. "An advisor. Accountability. It's not glamorous." He gave a short, reluctant laugh. "Sounds like him." We spent the next 2 hours at his kitchen table going through what he owed, what it would take to stabilize things, what a 5-year plan actually looked like on paper. His situation was not catastrophic. It was the slow accumulation of years of spending slightly faster than earning, of optimism that had outpaced income. Fixable. Not quickly, but steadily. When I stood to leave, he walked me to the door. "You really went all the way to Switzerland," he said. "Yes." And he really had all that sitting there. "For 25 years, I said. Patrick shook his head slowly. "I always thought the North just swallowed him up. I didn't know he was building something out there." Neither did I. We stood there a moment in the cold air coming through the open door. "He didn't hate me," Patrick said quietly. It wasn't a question. "No," I said. "He just trusted me differently. Those aren't the same thing." He nodded once. "It didn't fix everything. It wasn't supposed to." A year after the court dismissed Patrick's claim, I drove back up to Dauphin in late November. The cemetery was the same flat quiet it had been the day we buried him. Snow just beginning, indifferent, settling over everything evenly the way it does on the prairies. I stood at the headstone for a while. Simple granite, his name, his dates, the word surveyor beneath them because that was what he had asked for. I had spent the past year learning to manage the trust properly. Harriet had connected me with a board of advisors, all people my grandfather had worked with over the years. The distributions had continued without interruption. A school in a northern community had received funding for a new science lab. 3 young men from a reserve near Thompson were in their first year of post-secondary. A remediation project in the Athabasca Basin had received a research grant that would otherwise have gone unfunded. No press releases, no foundation dinners, no plaques with his name on them. Just steady. Patrick had completed his first 6 months of financial counseling. He sent me updates voluntarily now, brief and factual, in the tone of a man who had decided to stop being embarrassed by needing help. He had sold the second vehicle he didn't need. He had stopped renewing lines of credit he couldn't afford. He was not fixed. He was better. He was trying. I stood at the headstone and thought about the evening I had found the passport in the kitchen drawer, how I had sat on his bed and tried to make sense of stamps from countries he had never mentioned, how none of it had made sense until Zurich, and how Zurich had only made sense because of the letter, and how the letter had only made sense because of a lifetime of watching him. He had been a man who read the ground before he read the surface, who understood that what mattered most was usually underneath, invisible, taking its time. He had taught me to read a topographic map at this very kitchen table. He had traced the contour lines with his finger. He had said, elevation hides in the numbers. You have to learn to see what isn't showing. I had thought he was teaching me to survey. He was teaching me everything else too. I drove back through the flat winter fields as the light went early the way it does in Manitoba in November, the sky going from pale gray to a deep, almost purple in less than an hour. I thought about my classroom in Brandon, my students, the term starting in January. I thought about the stack of trust documents on the desk in my grandfather's house, which was my house now, which smelled like coffee and cedar and old maps. I thought about what it means to leave something behind that does not announce itself. That simply continues, quietly, long after you're gone. He had lived carefully and he had died the same way, in his own bed, in his own time, with his books on the shelf and his boots by the door. He had not waited for credit. He had not left a legacy designed to be admired. He had left instructions, and he had trusted me to follow them. If you have someone in your life like that, someone who lived quietly, who never needed the room to know what they were doing, take a moment to really look at what they've built. Not what's visible, what's underneath, because sometimes the most important things a person leaves behind are the things they never once talked about. And sometimes the greatest weight you can carry forward isn't grief. It's the responsibility they believed you were ready for. If that landed somewhere for you, I hope you'll stay with this channel. Leave a comment below. Tell me about someone who built something steady while no one was watching, because those are the stories worth keeping. There's something I keep coming back to even now. My grandfather never once asked to be understood. He just kept doing the work. I think about the version of him I had for 30 years, the man who drove a worn-out Silverado and clipped grocery coupons and grew tomatoes in his backyard in Dauphin. The man I thought I knew completely. And then I think about the passport in the kitchen drawer, thick with stamps from cities he never mentioned, the file cabinet with the security clearances, the $9 million sitting quietly in Zurich, building and building for 25 years, waiting for the right moment to become something useful. He wasn't hiding because he was ashamed. He was waiting because he understood something I had to learn the hard way, that the timing of honesty matters just as much as the honesty itself. He wrote it plainly in his letter. Money changes how people listen. He had watched enough of the world to know that an inheritance announced too early stops being a legacy and becomes a contest. So he said nothing, and he let the structure speak for itself when the time came. What strikes me most, looking back, is how little of what he built was about him. He had taken money from people who were extracting something from the land and from the communities living on it, and he had turned that money around and sent it back, quietly, without ceremony, without needing anyone to know. That takes a particular kind of intelligence, not the kind measured in degrees or titles, the kind that understands consequence, that can look at an action and trace its full shape forward in time, and then decide, without applause, what the right response is. Patrick needed to believe our grandfather had nothing because it was easier than accepting that he had been building something Patrick wasn't part of. I understand that now. Resentment is almost always about a story we tell ourselves about what we deserved and didn't receive. but my grandfather hadn't withheld anything from Patrick out of cruelty. He had simply directed his resources toward the people whose need was greatest and whose connection to that land ran deepest. He loved his son. He just understood that love and trust are not always the same allocation. The hardest part of inheriting something like this isn't the paperwork. It's the moment when you realize what it actually means to be trusted. Not flattered, not rewarded, trusted. As in, given something difficult and expected to carry it without collapsing. My grandfather picked me because he believed I was careful enough to hold the weight of his choices without letting them crush me or corrupt me. That is not a compliment. It is a responsibility. And the only way to honor it is to live up to it steadily, one decision at a time, for as long as it takes. Integrity doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. My grandfather proved that across 5 decades of quiet, precise, unglamorous work, and the courage it took. Not military courage, but the slower and lonelier kind. The courage to do the right thing when no one is watching and no one will ever know. That is the part of him I am still trying to learn. If there is a person in your life whose life looks small from the outside, look again. Look underneath. What they have built may be the most significant thing you will ever be trusted to carry forward.